All right, so 5:32, hard to believe, breaks over. So what Douglas and I are going to do is what we call a tagline debate. This can be a good activity to do in practice because it allows your debaters to actually get through a full round, every single speech. You can even do this 2-on-2, but we're going to do it 1-on-1. And really, make the full arguments that they might make in a debate round. Now, it's a very, very short version of a full round because each of our speeches is going to be just 1 minute. And our rebuttals will also just be a minute. So we're each going to make 4 speeches. We're going to have cross-examinations. It's going to be a full debate. And what we would like you all to do is just follow along with our debate. And if you have thoughts about what you're hearing, put them in the chat. I think Douglas or Roger made a really strong argument, or I think that's a really bad argument, or I don't understand that argument. Throw all those things in the chat because we want to make sure the purpose of us doing this now is for you to feel like you have a little bit stronger understanding of what the packet contains. So I'm going to go first. I'm Roger. I will be representing the affirmative side, and I'm going to be talking about cybersecurity and that. Yeah, so here we go, 1 minute, starting now. So US cybersecurity is not prepared to stop attacks. This is Marks and Schaefer 22. Hackers have broken into real news sites and posted fake news, according to Greenberg 20. So right now, our inherence here, our status quo, what's happening right now is that US cybersecurity is vulnerable to attacks, and we're going to show why that's a problem. Russian hackers and fake news got Donald Trump elected in 2016. And Trump's power has led to violence for years and continues to cause violence. The January 6th riots, and even people now responding with death threats to the FBI around the raid in Mar-a-Lago. Our plan is the United States federal government should increase cybersecurity by working with NATO to set up a platform to share cyber intelligence with other countries, increase NATO's investment in technology, and set up joint cybersecurity teams. And this is going to solve the problem because NATO's funding and resource sharing will prevent future cyber attacks. All right, that's my minute. And so now I would open myself up to cross-examination. For the purpose of this debate, our cross-examinations are just going to be one question. In a real debate round, they'd be 2 or 3 minutes
long. You mentioned that there were death threats being made. Could you clarify where you provided that specific evidence from the things you provided in your round?
I just know that that's true. It's not actually in my evidence.
Okay.
All right, and now
usually in this moment in an actual rank, students would make sure and point that out that the evidence is not in the packet. They were not able to provide the evidence, so that's just gotta make sure that that's stated.
All right, so let's just go ahead.
So Douglas Matuti, I'll be representing the negative side of the debate. So I'll start now with 1 minute. Biden is already working with NATO and has been since 2001. And NATO is already prepared to counter cyber attacks, and this was stated by Baldur in 2018. So we already have a plan in motion, right? We have the president's already making these moves to prevent these actions, and NATO is already prepared. There's no need to increase the cybersecurity when NATO is already making an emphasis on it. Social media platforms promote stories that cause outrage, even if they aren't true. These stories are from local sources, not from Russia. Stewart 2020 shows that we should be focusing on the internal problems rather than the external problems, because the fake news are creating some sort of digital paranoia in the community. Social media controls of news and harassment of journalists are big problems, not Russia, right? So if journalists are not allowed to do their job properly and get stuck completely by this fake news, then we just have to filter all the bad news to make sure that the individuals are getting the right news. People are getting more unreliable news from social media from many different sources. It's really hard to filter all the information with all the fake news around.
All right, so my question for you, Douglas, is are Russian cyber attacks still happening right now?
Yes, they are, but NATO is already working to prevent that from happening.
All right, sounds good. And so again, the reason why I'm asking that question, and I'll talk about it in my speech, is that I'm trying to set up an argument that I'm about to make in my next speech. Here's my second affirmative constructed. Again, 1 minute on the clock. Here we go. So my opponent made two arguments against my inherency. He talked about how Biden's already working with NATO and has been for a while, and NATO is already preparing to counter cyber attacks. I think these are both valid points, but the fact is they haven't actually stopped Russia from making cyber attacks. And Russian cyber attacks are still impacting the US. And in fact, my evidence is from 2022, which says that US cybersecurity is not prepared to stop attacks, and that it postdates the arguments about what the US and NATO have done in the past. With regards to Russia not being the only cause of these harms, right, of these fake news stories, I can see that that's true as well. But I would argue that our biggest threat right now is keeping Russia out of our elections and stopping the meddling. We can deal with internal things in the US in other ways, with better, policing and social media, but we need to stop Russia because they're always going to not have our best interest in mind. All right, that's my time.
I'm trying to come up with a question right now. Would you say that focusing the cybersecurity only on Russia will allow people in the US to feel more secure when so many fake propaganda is being spread throughout social media and social platforms?
That's it's not totally clear how people are going to feel if this plan works, but I think they will feel comfortable at least knowing that Russia is not the one creating their news stories.
Okay, and then I'll start with my minutes. My opponent has made some really interesting points, especially focusing on the aspect that we should focus on the external aspect of Russia, potentially to prevent further attacks that could affect the country in itself. But the issue is that if we focus the United States to specify and just target Russia instead of focusing on the internal issues, it would just create an imbalance and allow internal hacking to happen. Because hacking does not only happen from the side of Russia, it also happens internally. And it is unclear if NATO will respond to cyber attacks. This was a research done by Alderman, Mayer, and Raiji in 2022. So we cannot rely on NATO to specify or focus only on the attacks against Russia, but the United States has to focus internally and prevent things to happen from their backyard, right? We cannot just step away and allow an organization to focus outside, internalize what is happening within your structure of the country and not having that structure feel.
All right. So at this point, our constructive speeches are over. And generally speaking, at this point in the debate, we tell debaters not to introduce new arguments. When we go into the rebuttals, right, we're going to tell them, you may have spoken about, you may read evidence, to respond to arguments that have already been made or something like that. But you're not generally going to come up with whole new arguments that have not been touched on at all previously, right? What we're going to try and do in our last two speeches each is convince you, the judge, that our arguments are the most impactful and try and get you to vote for our team. So my question for Douglas after your second constructive speech is, do you think there are other countries in NATO that might be able to help the US with their cybersecurity problems?
I believe they are, as NATO is an alliance of many countries, so there potentially be an alliance within other countries that could help develop the United States cybersecurity to be stronger.
All right, great. So again, if you're newer to this activity, Douglas or I could have taken prep time before any of our speeches, and it's not mandated when debaters have to take prep time, although we do generally encourage them to save their prep time more for the rebuttal so they can really put stronger arguments together. They should try and plan out their earlier speeches because they have access to the evidence and they know basically what arguments are going to be made by the other side. But You know, so at this point in the debate, you might hear more of us take more prep time, that kind of thing. Also for the rebuttals, the negative team gets to go first. So Douglas is going to get to extend on some arguments that he's already made, and start to convince you to try to vote for him, and maybe even offer some other arguments that he didn't make in the 2NC, in the second negative constructed speech, because I haven't had a chance to respond to those yet. So he might make even more arguments and make it even more tough for me to respond in his first negative rebuttal. Douglas, as soon as you're ready.
So one of the things the affirmative side mentioned earlier is that hackers have broken into news sites and spread fake news, right? So that clearly shows an aspect that there is an internal problem. The ability of people to develop their hacking skills has grown exponentially throughout the years, and focusing just on the aspect of Russia instead of educating people within the country would potentially affect us, and expecting NATO to take care of that, it's not the smartest plan. For anybody who owns plants, you know that root rot is the worst possible thing that can happen in a plant, and that happens internally. It doesn't happen externally. So relying on NATO to prevent the cyber attacks will not be the most efficient thing or the most official step, as it leaves the backdoor open for the internal attacks. An email or any backdoor that can open to any VPN or cybersecurity internal attack, it's the worst thing that could happen. And just relying on NATO to use other organizations and countries to prevent cyber attacks will leave the United States internally to get weaker.
All right, so unlike the constructive speeches, the rebuttals are not followed by cross-examinations, right? So I will launch right into my first affirmative rebuttal and try and convince you all why Douglas is crazy and has no idea what he's talking about and why you should vote for me. So here we go. Judges, as a quick reminder, my plan is to have NATO countries work together, and the United States work with NATO to set up a platform to share cyber intelligence and joint cybersecurity teams, and invest a lot of money that is not currently being invested in international cybersecurity. My plan creates totally new systems and alliances between countries in a way that has never been done before to help identify cyber threats and try and prevent them before they even get into the roots of those plants that Douglas was talking about. So my argument is a totally new approach that I think is worth voting for. It may not solve all fake news issues, as Douglas has made clear, but it's going to stop Russia from having an exceedingly large influence on our elections and how people in general get their news in the United States. All right.
As the affirmative has made some really interesting points, and first of all, thank you for such a insightful speech as you had. I believe that the negative side should take the win in this case, because we have provided evidence that there's an internal issue with fake news and fake information being spread. As I already stated, Biden is already working with NATO, and NATO is already focusing on cyber attacks. So rather than putting all those resources and efforts that get shared throughout the alliances and the countries that are involved in NATO, the United States should be focusing in the internal aspect of things, because that is the things that are affecting the people at the communities, people at schools, right? They're not talking in a global aspect. Unless these cyber attacks are threatening lives, we should be focusing on developing and strengthening the cybersecurity internally rather than trying to tap into an organization. And that's why I believe the negative side should take the win, because we should focus those resources that my opponent mentioned into the internal cybersecurity.
All right, and I'll make my last speech here. So here we go. Judges, I think you should vote for me, the affirmative side in this debate, because I think I've proven that there is a problem that exists that could be partially solved by implementing my plan, right? While the negative makes arguments about additional things that could be solved or other problems that could be solved in other ways, he doesn't actually say that my plan would be ineffective at solving partially for some of these problems, right? He says we should focus more internally. Sure, But why not work with NATO? Why not have partner resources? Why not have those joint cybersecurity teams with other countries? And by the way, I did also read evidence on this, right? My very first speech, my solvency evidence, talked about how NATO funding and resource sharing would help prevent cyber attacks. So don't let him make an argument about how one side is more evidence-based than the other. My evidence also shows that my plan would solve some of this cybersecurity problem and not let Russia have too much of an influence on the US. All right, that's our debate. What we would like you all to do now is just share in the chat or out loud anything that you heard which you think was interesting or could be potentially challenging to teach about or might be confusing to students, or just general thoughts. What are your reactions to what you just heard? So we got some in the chat already. I like the question of whether to prioritize Russia as an external threat or to see internal threats as equally dangerous. I think that will definitely be a major point to talk about with your students this year. It was helpful to hear the cross-examination questions because the way you asked them were very strategic in choosing what to ask, for sure, leading into the next argument, and definitely something to work on with your students as well.